Today's reading is from Luke 5:33 through 35. One day, some people said to Jesus, John the Baptist's disciples fast and pray regularly, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. Why are your disciples always eating and drinking? Jesus responded, do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not, but someday the groom will be taken from them, and then they will fast.
Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery. I know you're like, wow, strong opener. Strong opening. It released in 1997, the first movie. It became a franchise before we called them that, which was my junior into senior year of high school. If you've not seen it, it's a spoof on James Bond with Michael Myers, former SNL cast member. Actually, I think he was the host of SNL last night. I haven't seen it yet, so don't spoil it. In the second and third installments of Austin Powers, they introduced an evil henchman from Clydesblank, Scotland, whose name I can't mention in church. But this particular villain character was crude, foul-mouthed, bad manners. He was characterized by going on long, emotional monologues that would kind of meander around and typically end with a bout of flatulence. But in every one of the monologues, if you're fond of quoting movies, as I am, his monologues are just chock full of incredible quotables, which I use all the time. And none have probably become more famous than this one.
I can't stop eating. I eat because I'm unhappy. And I'm unhappy because I eat. It's a vicious cycle.
I eat because I'm unhappy, and I'm unhappy because I eat. It's a vicious cycle. This is week 4 of a Lent series that I'm calling What If Jesus Came? That's the question that we're reflecting on, right? What if Jesus came today to us, not, little baby Jesus, but adult, walking, talking, healing Jesus? What if he showed up and hung out with your friends or started working at your job or began hosting a podcast or whatever? How would we respond to him? What would we do? And essentially what I've suggested in this series is we would reject him just like people did 2,000 years ago, and for the same basic reason, that just like them, we are born into a world that hands us stories, narratives, that whether we realize we're doing it or not, we accept these stories and we rely on them to make sense of our lives. And over the course of time, we so deeply internalize them that they shape just about everything about us. How we think, how we feel, how we speak, what we value, where we even place our bodies in space and time. If Jesus came to us today, his life and his teaching, both how he lived and what he said, would be such a challenge, both implicitly and explicitly. Like you would just look at his life and go, oh, man, I just don't know that I could do that. His life would implicitly challenge you, and some of his teachings would explicitly challenge you. Like would just come right out and call you on stuff. That you would find yourself, just like they did 2,000 years ago, feeling so challenged by him that either out of anger or sadness, probably mostly fear, you would struggle to give up the stories that have so shaped your life, and you would reject him. And I would too. And so what I'm doing in these last weeks of the series is just talking about some of the narratives that we inherit that get us to this place. So last week we looked at what I called the narrative of accumulation. Today we're going to look at what I'm calling the narrative of consumption. I could also have called this the narrative of pleasure, as in the pleasure that we derive from certain consumptive behaviors, like eating and drinking, right? Eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I was born into a world that implicitly taught me life is found in pleasure and enjoyment. The kind of pleasure that comes from consumptive behaviors, whether that's eating or drinking or countless other ways that we consume things in this world. So the first question is, well, what's wrong with any of that? And on one level, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing is wrong with consumptive behaviors like eating and drinking. On one level, of course, you need them to live. But you don't do those things to live mostly. I've never eaten a thing in my life because I absolutely needed it. I eat things because they taste awesome, and I enjoy the experience of eating and drinking, and that's why most of us do it too. And on one level, there's nothing wrong with that. So in the text that you heard a minute ago, some people come to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, the way that the question is framed in this version of the gospel is, why are you and your disciples always eating and drinking? Now, just to put it in context, in Jesus' day, in his religious culture ecosystem, if you were a public religious figure like Jesus, your life was characterized by a kind of asceticism. You abstained regularly from things like eating and drinking. You fasted. Okay? So anybody that looked at your life, you would have come across to them as like, right, well, they don't eat, they don't drink, they barely sleep, they don't have any fun, they're serious religious people. They don't have time for all of that, being human things. And that was normal. Like, notice that they quote a couple of examples. John the Baptist, he is described in the Gospels as living in the desert, wearing a kind of wool garment and a belt, and eating locusts for food and some honey. That was his diet. That was the kind of thing that you're talking about. The religious authority figures, one sect were called the Pharisees. These were very serious people. They had a lot of religious laws that they were very careful to follow, and many of those laws involved things that you do and don't eat or drink. So in Jesus' religious ecosystem, if you're a serious public religious figure, you fast all the time. You regularly abstain from eating and drinking. Jesus didn't do that. In fact, he gained a reputation by comparison. Again, you got to put yourself in their context. They're so used to figures like Jesus not eating and drinking regularly and making sure that you know they're not eating and drinking, that Jesus gained a bit of a reputation for being a glutton and a drunk in his context. He and his disciples are always eating and drinking, and it created so much cognitive dissonance for the religious people of his day that somebody needed to ask. Jesus, you're a public religious figure. You're out teaching people. You're a rabbi. Every other public religious figure we have ever known regularly abstains from food and drink. You guys don't do that. You're always in eating and drinking. What's up? Now, if Jesus is our model for all things, then there clearly cannot be anything wrong with the consumptive behaviors of eating and drinking. Jesus and his disciples did it all the time. And by connection, I would assume then there's nothing inherently wrong with the physical pleasure that you derive from behaviors like eating and drinking. Because again, that's typically why we do these things. Yes, we need fuel to animate our bodies, but that's not why you eat stuff. Most of us eat and drink what we eat and drink because we enjoy eating and drinking the things that we enjoy eating and drinking. It's a pleasurable experience, or at least we want it to be, right? We want it to be. So there's nothing wrong with that. Life is a gift. It is given to you. It is to be enjoyed. Being human is to be able to enjoy the years that we have on this planet in our physical bodies is a gift. I think just like you would, if you're a parent with your kids, you would want your kids to enjoy their existence. I think God looks down at all of us as his kids and wants us to enjoy our existence. And some of the greatest moments in your life are when you're with people you love, eating stuff you love. Right? I mean, just think about your favorite memories. You were probably with people you loved, eating something you loved. This is life. Right? There's nothing better. If you're a coffee drinker, I'm not. If you are, there's nothing better than a warm cup of coffee on a cold morning, or so I'm told. There's nothing better than a pizza on a Friday night. There's nothing better than a great wedding banquet with your friends and family. There's nothing better than those things, right? In some ways, we live for those moments. Nothing wrong with that on one level. Jesus and his disciples were always eating and drinking. Cool. And yet, Jesus does say to his questioners that there will come a day when his disciples will fast, which implies that they should fast. There will come a day when they will fast, which suggests or implies that they should fast, meaning regularly abstain from things that taste good, feel good, kind of stuff. The question is why? Why do we not fast now, but we will fast later? So the question that Jesus gets asked in Matthew's gospel, why are you always eating and drinking? The clear context here is they're comparing him to other religious figures of the day, which I've already mentioned. The way that question gets phrased in Matthew and Mark's version of the same story, the questioners don't ask, why are you always eating and drinking? Instead, they make it more pointed. They ask, why don't you fast like the Pharisees and the religious leaders? Now, again, like can be about frequency. That seems to come out in the English translation you just heard a minute ago. They say the religious leaders fast regularly. So when someone asks Jesus, hey, why don't you guys fast like the other religious people do? They could be asking about frequency. They fast all the time. You guys don't fast all the time, if at all. Can you explain that? It could be about frequency, like why don't you fast as often as? But Jesus' response to their question suggests that the issue is not really frequency. It's not so much about why don't you fast as often, but like refers to purpose. That the reason Jesus and his disciples don't fast as regularly as other religious leaders is because they don't need to fast for the same reason. And Jesus indicates that when he uses this metaphor of being guests at a wedding. He says, look, if you go to a wedding, right, do people mourn when they're at a wedding? No, weddings are not time for mourning. Weddings are time for celebration. You go to a wedding and you want to have a great meal and you want to have a great dessert, which I think wedding cakes are overrated. That's just my personal opinion. I would prefer an ice cream bar if you're getting married and I'm going to be invited. This is my opinion. But you want a great meal. You want a great dessert ice cream bar, right? You want great drinks. Like, weddings are times for celebration. They're not time for mourning. In Jesus' day, that was the primary purpose of fasting. Fasting was an act of spiritual mourning, particularly over your sin. You acknowledge there's this good, gracious, wonderful God. God kind of has a standard for your life. You rarely live up to that standard. Maybe you feel badly about that. Maybe you're a little worried. God's not okay with that. Fasting was a behavior that was connected. It was an act of contrition. It was a way of you acknowledging, I'm a sinful person. I feel badly about that. I want to reconnect with God. I want to get right with God. Fasting was an act of humbling yourself, acknowledging that you're dependent on God, kind of bringing yourself back to God. That was the purpose of fasting in Jesus' day, which is precisely why Jesus and his disciples didn't do it. Jesus did not need to abstain from food in order to reconnect with God. Jesus had a pretty vital, connected relationship with the Father. Jesus did not need to fast in order to gain God's forgiveness. Jesus had nothing he needed to be forgiven for. But for the same reason, his disciples didn't need to fast. His disciples didn't need to fast as a way to sort of curry God's presence with them. God was already present with them in the person Jesus of Nazareth. They didn't need to fast in order to gain God's forgiveness. You and I have been taught to think that forgiveness is something that you do when something bad has happened. So someone has offended you in some way, you want to repair the relationship, and so you grant forgiveness. And we tend to think that's what forgiveness is. That is certainly an expression of forgiveness. That is how forgiveness can express itself in a relationship. But the word forgiveness means forgiving, as in you give yourself before anything has happened. Forgiveness is not an act that you engage in when something has gone wrong, reactively. Forgiveness is your proactive giving of self to another. in the Judeo-Christian tradition, forgiveness is almost essential to or equivalent to what we would call agape love. It's just a total self-giving to another. It is that self-giving that makes forgiveness as pardon even possible. The only reason I'm going to pardon you or absolve you from your wrongdoing is because a long time ago I already gave myself to you. So the disciples don't have to fast to seek forgiveness. They've already received it. Jesus has already given himself to them. He's there. His life given to them is already the expression of God's unfailing love and forgiveness and commitment to them. They are living in a wedding. The God they love, who loves them, is with them, and they're together. There's no need to mourn over sin. There's no need to seek reconciliation. There's no need for an act of contrition. And for that reason, they don't have to fast. Because in their world, that's what fasting is for. That's why you do it. Now, the people in his world probably had no compartment in their brains for that, which is what creates the cognitive dissonance. We're all fasting, and you're not. Could you explain why that is? And that's what Jesus is trying to do here. He isn't saying fasting is bad or that nobody should fast. He says very clearly, there will come a time when we will. It's just not right now. The time when we will fast, right? It's not that you should or you shouldn't. It's that when we fast on that day, it will be for a different reason. And this continues to be true for Christian people. So just to clear up any confusion, this is the season of Lent. The season of Lent lasts for a period of weeks every year. It is a run-up to Good Friday where we reflect on the significance of Jesus' death. And the purpose of the season of Lent is to reflect on sin, the kind of sin that leads you to crucify the God that you claim to love. We visit Lent once a year because it's very important for our spiritual lives once a year to sit in these weeks and to be honest about our lives and how we live. But we do not live in Lent. Christians are not Lent people. We are Easter people. We live all year long in the reality of a resurrected, risen, living God, and that is supposed to produce for us joy and hope and peace. We don't live in Lent, but we do have to visit it from time to time. One of the practices that is built into the season of Lent is the practice of fasting. That might lead you to believe that the purpose of fasting is because we're sorry about our sin. That's how they used to fast. That is not why Christians fast today. Jesus will go on in this passage. I didn't have these verses read to you, but he will go on to say, right, there will come a day when my disciples will fast. When I will be taken from them, and on that day, when I'm taken from them, they will fast. So he's saying they're going to fast. They're not fasting now because we don't need to mourn over sin. We're going to fast then. It's just going to be for a different purpose. And his way of describing that was like, look, you cannot take a new patch of cloth and sew it onto an old garment. You try to wash that thing, the patch is going to shrink, the garment's not going to shrink anymore, and it's going to rip away, it's going to tear the garment even more. You can't put new wine into old wineskins. The new wine is going to ferment, and it's going to burst the skins. The take-home message is you can't just seamlessly mesh old and new ways of life. They are living in an existing religious ecosystem. They have all kinds of beliefs, assumptions, and practices that mean something in their world. Jesus is coming along and saying, I'm inviting you into a new way of being human, into a new way of thinking about what it means to be religious human in this world. Fasting can still be a part of that life, and in fact, it needs to be. But you can't just whole cloth pick it up and bring it over here and drop it down. Me and my followers are going to fast. We're just not going to fast for the same reason. So the question becomes, what is the reason? Why do Christian people fast today if it is not because we're all sorry about our sin and we're trying to get right with God? Well, that brings me back to my Austin Powers opener and this vicious cycle of I'm unhappy because I eat, and I eat because I'm unhappy. The physical pleasures associated with consumptive behaviors, there's nothing wrong with that. Life is a gift. Eating and drinking is a wonderful thing. Nothing wrong with that. The problem with the pleasure associated with consumptive behaviors is that if you're not careful, all of life becomes about the pleasure associated with consumptive behaviors. If I diagnose this in my own life, here's how it happens. I start with something that I enjoy, and it's fine. But pretty soon, that thing that I enjoy becomes something that I need. So if you're a coffee drinker, I suppose, it starts with, man, isn't it just nice having a warm cup of coffee in the morning? Yeah, I guess. But then it turns into, I can't function without a cup of coffee. Like, you do not want to be around me if I have not had a certain drug in my system. It's nice having dinner at 5:30 or 6 o'clock. But what happens when 7 o'clock rolls around and you haven't had dinner yet? And now you're a nightmare of a human being that nobody can be around. We all say that. You've said this, I'm sure. And you say it jokingly, but it's what was actually happening. We say things like, hey, don't judge me. I'm eating my feelings right now. Because that's exactly what you're doing. And it's exactly what I do. Being human in this world, I know that we are more materially prosperous than any human beings who have ever lived on the planet. We have more than any humans have ever dreamt of having. And yet, it really has not changed the basic experience that being human in the world is hard. It's hard. Marriages are hard. Kids are hard. Relationships can be hard. Jobs can be hard. Right? The world in which you live, it can be a hard place. We happen to live in a kind of unique time in human history where you are being bombarded every day, all the time, with information that humans you don't have the capacity for it today any more than humans did 2,000 years ago. They just didn't know any of it. Being human every day is hard. And I'm just diagnosing this in my life. Maybe you're not like this, and I apologize that this sermon was a waste of your time. But what happens in my life is every day when I get up, and it doesn't take long, I hit a moment where I just want to check out. Something about my existence is hard. It's my marriage, it's my kids, it's my job, it's my own kind of inner world, whatever the stuff is. It's my financial reality, it's stuff going on in politics or whatever the stuff is. I get to a certain point where life is hard and I just don't want to deal with it. And so I find ways to escape. And the ways in which I escape are typically consumptive behaviors that give me a momentary, fleeting sense of comfort and pleasure. They just punctuate the difficulty of life with like a little oasis of joy. And look no judgment. No judgment. If you're like, shoot, I do that too. Cool. Look, no judgment. We're all humans. We're doing the best we can. Life is hard. If every once in a while you got to hit the pause button and be like, look, I'm out for a minute. I'll be back in a second. You know, and you got to check out, okay, it happens, right? We're all doing the best we can. But what can happen is that life just becomes one of those checkouts after another, after another, after another, after another, until your whole life, every day, all the time, all you're trying to do is get away from your own humanity and from just the pain of being human in the world. Consumptive behaviors and the pleasure that comes with consumptive behaviors becomes a kind of social pain management. All of life just becomes eating and drinking and being merry, not because those are wonderful gifts from God and how fortunate are we to be able to do those things, but because I need to do them in order to cope with my existence. And once you get to the place where you start needing those kind of momentary safety releases, then you start worrying about not having them. I mean, I talked this about last week with this narrative of accumulation. I'm already rich. I already have a fertile field. It already produces fine crops. I already have enough to store in barns. What in God's name do I need bigger barns for? Because on some level, I'm still worried. I'm worried that I don't have enough. Any kind of consumptive behavior can go down that road. Jesus told his disciples, do not worry about what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. When consumptive behaviors, and specifically the pleasure associated with consumptive behaviors, become a need for us, I have to go to these things as a way of kind of numbing just the difficulty of being human, and it's literally how I sort of get through the day. Then eventually now I'm just worrying about where am I going to experience my next sort of momentary release from pain. When you need these things, and then your whole life becomes about worrying about these things, you begin to develop the kind of character that can't handle pain of any kind. Emotional pain, psychological pain, existential pain, economic pain. You can't face any of it without some kind of numbing agent. You quite literally get locked. Every day, you get locked into a vicious cycle of kind of materiality. All that matters to you, and you didn't mean to get there. It just kind of became what life became. Every day is just about eating and drinking, trying to carve out as much happiness as I can get in this hard, difficult life. And that made me feel good for the moment. But like your happiness, and I think you know this, I've mentioned this many times, happiness is not equivalent to a momentary experience of pleasure. That's amusement. An amusement that amuse, without your brain. Amusement. That's what amuse means. The momentary experiences of amusement are literally a mental checkout. It's taking a minute to go, I don't want to deal with reality. I just want to have fun and enjoy myself. Again, in and of itself, not a bad thing. But when all of life becomes thinking that's what happiness is, happiness is creating space where I don't have to think about reality and I can just sort of feel good. The Greek word for happiness is well-being, and it covers your whole, everything about you. Emotional, social, psychological, spiritual well-being. Cake makes me feel happy in the moment. I enjoy it. If I ate cake all the time, that would make me miserable. Something similar happens in a spiritual realm. When we kind of mistake this idea that the pleasure associated with consumptive behaviors is like, okay, that's a gift. Like, isn't it cool that God made food taste good? That's great. But if life starts to become, I need those things, I worry about those things, and then all of life becomes about essentially pleasure seeking without me even realizing that's what I'm doing. But I'm just kind of trying to get through the day and sort of numb the difficulty of being human in the world. I lock myself into this vicious cycle of I escape, I feel good momentarily, and then I re-enter life, and then it's hard again and I don't like it, so I escape, and then I feel good for a minute, and then I re-enter, it's hard, I escape, and around you go, and it doesn't change. Okay. The purpose of fasting for Christian people in the world one theologian calls it an act of resistance. It's an act of resistance against this kind of way of being in the world. A philosopher named John Verveek talks about it. He uses the phrase salience landscape. Now, it sounds fancy, but think about what happens if you drive a car. Think about what happens when you're driving a car. You are all the time, not realizing you're doing it, you're bouncing your vision back and forth between kind of the immediate foreground, kind of around your car, what's immediately around you, and the background, right? You're looking down the road to where you're going, and your vision's always kind of modulating between those two things, foreground, background, foreground, background. And you need to do that in order to drive safely. If you didn't do that, if your vision got locked, let's say you just focused your vision on the front hood of your car, it wouldn't take long before you got into some serious trouble. You have to bounce your vision back and forth, the sort of foreground and kind of the bigger gestalt background, okay? The same thing has to happen spiritually. What can happen when all of life becomes about the pleasure associated with consumptive behaviors? It's like getting your vision locked on the hood of your car. Fasting is a way of breaking that frame of reference. It's getting your vision up and acknowledging there's a spiritual background in which my life is nested. I am not exclusively what I eat, drink, and feel in this material world. Have you ever had that situation where like you had some kind of a problem and you just like focused on it, you're trying to solve it, can't figure it out? And so you just put it down and you step away and you go do something entirely unrelated. And when you do the thing that's unrelated, it's like, pew, like you have this incredible insight that solves your problem. I used to watch House, a medical drama on Fox, and they're like, Gregory, this was his thing. Every single episode, he's like this brilliant doctor trying to solve these medical mysteries, and he can't solve it. And then he just goes and has lunch with a friend, and his friend says something totally unrelated, and boom, he has this insight. That's what fasting is supposed to do. Fasting is an act of resistance. It's a stepping away from the material comforts and pleasures of the world. It's every once in a while, and it looks different for every person, and it'll be different stuff. But it is an act of resistance. It's you stepping away from the things that taste good and feel good and give you sort of a momentary respite, right? Comfort in the pain of life. It is just every once in a while, it's stepping away from those things to gain a higher state of consciousness, if you like that phrase. It's a spiritual act. It's the recognition that if I get locked into this material world and I don't ever get my vision up and recognize that my life, my existence is nested in this spiritual background, then it deadens me to the stuff of the Spirit. It deafens me to the voice of God in my life. When Jesus says, one day I'll be taken from them and then they'll fast, I don't think he's just referring to like he's going to be crucified and they'll fast for a couple days until he rises from the dead. I think he's talking about I'm going to die, I'm going to rise, I'm going to ascend back to heaven. I'm going to be taken from them in the flesh. I'm not going to be here in the body anymore. I am going to be present to them in the Spirit. That's why they're going to fast. Fasting will be something that they will need to do to every once in a while separate themselves from the physical pleasures of life to get their eyes up and remember they're spiritual people. And they need to be able to hear my voice in their life. And if they don't fast, then they will just get locked in to the eating and the drinking and the being merry and all of the pleasure that comes from that as a way of basically coping with being human. And that might be good for your momentary enjoyment, but it will not be good for your ultimate well-being. So Christians today are supposed to fast, not because we're sad about our sin, though we might be. Today we fast as an act of resistance against the narrative of consumption. You have a good and gracious God who's made all kinds of activities in this world pleasurable, and what a gift that is. And we should thank God for that. But we have to be very careful that we don't turn to those things in order to give us comfort in the midst of the pain of being human. So if you're unhappy, don't eat. That will just make you more unhappy. Instead, consider in your own way, in a way that fits and works with your life. Instead, follow Jesus into this world of just take a step back. Find the thing in your life that has become for you your source of escape. The thing that makes you feel okay in the midst of the pain and the suffering, and periodically step away from it. Put it down, walk away from it, and trust that you are a child of God. There is a good and gracious God in this world who loves you and is taking care of you. And things are going to be okay. Not because you have these comfortable experiences to turn to, but because God has promised that it will be. Life is not found in consumption or the pleasures associated with consumption. It's found in God. If you want happiness, fleeting moment of pleasure, then go consume. If you want well-being, full and abundant life, the kind of life that God created us to have and promises us to have, you have to fast. We're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion together. If you're new here, this is your first time with us, the sacrament of communion is a sacrament of remembrance. When you come forward in a minute and you take the bread that represents Jesus' broken body and the juice that represents his shed blood, you are remembering. As hard as life is, this is one of the paradoxes of Jesus. Being human in this world is hard, and Jesus comes to you and says, look, I can make it easier. But to make it easier, I got to make it a little harder in some ways. And you're going to have to trust me. So when Jesus comes to you and says, it's easier to eat and drink, that's easier. It's harder to fast. But you got to trust me. You have to know the God who's asking you. And it is the one who's broken his body for you and shed his blood for you. A God of perfect, unfailing love and faithfulness. When that God asks you for something, that's where you got to start. If that's the God asking, okay, then I'm going to give it a thought. So this is an act of remembering. We need to be reminded every week. Get our eyes up, shift our salience landscape. But it's also an act of participation. If you are in the room this morning and you're like, man, that kind of feels like me. My life is hard. My marriage is hard. My kids are hard. My job's hard. My health is hard. It's hard. It's hard. And every single day, yeah, that resonates with me. I want to check out too. Okay, you got to check out every once in a while. Okay, no judgment. But if there's a part of you that's like, man, I really do want to find a better way to be human in this world than just checking out all the time. Well, that's the life that Jesus is inviting you into. So if on some level you would rather have that kind of life, even though you have no idea how to put that together yet, and that's okay, then that's what the table's for. You should come forward. Come, give your life to Christ. Be a part of the church. Join the body of people that are trying to live as faithfully with him as we can. If you've not done this before, in just a minute, I'll invite you to stand. If you're able, I'll dismiss you starting in the back rows. I invite you to come down our center aisle here. We'll have people on the sides of the stage to distribute prepackaged communion cups. I invite you to take that to your seat using the side aisles, and then you can take that during this last song as you feel that. All are welcome. You want to follow Jesus? Come to the table. I'll invite you to stand if you're able. Let me pray for us, and then invite you to come forward. God, we thank you for your great love for us. We thank you that so much of our physical lives are enjoyable. What a gift. Thank you for that. Forgive us for turning those kinds of behaviors and the joy and the pleasure associated with them into our very lives. For getting our eyes and vision stuck in the immediate foreground of our material world and forgetting that we're nested in a larger spiritual reality, one where you are king, where you're Lord over our lives and over creation. I pray that as we get our eyes up, that we recall who you are and how you love us and the life you've created for us, that it would fill us with peace and joy and hope. Do a work in us this morning as we come to your table and receive these gifts. Continue to work on our lives, that you would give us the life that you promised to give us. As we surrender ourselves to you, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
You're turning over tables and calling for return to our lives upon the altar, the things we did at first. You clearing out the temple, you're clearing out the dirt, for we are your territory, Lord, we are your church. We are your people, you are our God, we are your temple, make us holy like you are. You see a holy nation, a flock to consecrate, a chosen generation, a people called to pray. So help us, God, to please you where only you can see. For every moment matters in eternity. We are your people, you are our God, we are your temple, make us holy like you are. We are your children, you set us apart, God, for your glory, make us holy like you are. Mark your people with your presence, make us a place where you like to dwell. May we heed your hand's correction. Oh Lord, our shepherd, you do all things well. Your love as firm as it is tender. Your law is perfect and your judgment's true. As we run to Resurrender, you will restore what we return to you. You are restoring as we yield anew. We are your people, you are our God, we are your temple, make us holy like you are. We are your children, you set us apart, God, for your glory, make us holy like you are. If you're calling, we're coming. We're not walking, we're running. God, we need resurrender. So we resurrender.